And as you hopefully know, in today's webinar, our speaker Tom Beeks will explore CLIL, content and language integrated learning, and how it can be applied to supporting EAL learners in international schools. During the webinar, feel free to use the chat option to send any questions as they come to you, and Tom will either address them there and then, or I will collect them and pose them to Tom at the end of the webinar. And with that, well, I'll hand over to Tom to take us through today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Shaka. And it's brilliant to see so many people from all over the world joining us today. I always love seeing the different array of places people join from. So hopefully in today's webinar, there'll be something for everyone, because I think the beauty of CLIL, as we're going to discover, is that it can really be applied in all kinds of different contexts and different ways. So this is what our aims are for today. Most broadly, we're going to look at what CLIL is, and in particular, how that might be relevant to an EAL context, particularly for international schools. But a lot of what we talk about will be applicable in other contexts as well. And we'll look at what that might look like, especially in an international school context, and how applying CLIL might appear in the classroom, and also at the planning level as well. And we're also going to focus a little bit on using home languages or translanguaging, and looking at how that might be used to enhance CLIL approach. And so hopefully by the end of this, you might feel a bit more confident about being able to integrate language and content in an EAL context. And for the learners that you work with, hopefully they'll be better able to develop both language skills and content knowledge. So this is the map of what we're doing today. And as always, I'm just going to start by, I guess, defining terms a little bit. And we're going to look at what CLIL is and why it might be useful for us. And I'm sure many of you may already know this, but CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. And it's what happens when you put together content learning and language learning. It's an amalgam of the two, and it emerged in a European context in the late 80s or early 90s, and it was designed as a fusion of characteristics that had previously been seen as quite distinct and separate, whereas language teaching was over here, content teaching was over here, and they weren't really at that time thought of as something that could be happening at the same time. So the whole idea of CLIL was that we can have these things happening simultaneously in the same classroom. So you might want to think of it as, buy one, get one free, or 2 for 1 in the terminology of shopping or supermarkets, which I think is why it's often been employed by many schools and even mandated by governments as an approach. However, I think we need to recognize that the idea that CLIL is some kind of quick fix or panacea as a solution to having multilingual classrooms is to be questioned, because I think, as we're going to see, unless it's implemented with appropriate support and training for both the staff who are delivering it and the pupils who are learning, it can actually be counterproductive. So what actually are the characteristics of CLIL? Well, as we've already mentioned, the main thing is this dual focus with both language and content, and they're both the same level of importance. There isn't really one that's above the other. The other main characteristic is that it's taught via the learner's second language. I'm using the term L2, or additional language, of course, because it may well be their third, fourth, fifth. But the whole idea is that the medium instruction is not the learner's first language or home language. The third point is that CLIL is usually curriculum embedded, and it's connected to the curriculum. The language is integral to what's being taught in the curriculum of the school. And that does mean that its inclusion must be planned and intentional. It can't just be happening on an ad hoc or a spontaneous basis. It also emerged, the whole CLIL model, in a social constructivist model of education or learning, and this is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea, but this is the idea where learning is interactive, it's mediated by the teacher, and it's more student-led. So that's led to the kind of methodologies we've seen, such as project-based learning or more task-based approaches, more inquiry-based approaches, which are still quite popular in some places today, although I'm aware there's been a move away in some countries from this trend. And that leads to the final point about CLIL, which is really important, is that it involves lots of language supportive methodologies, but it is not a methodology in and of itself. So actually, I think that's a real advantage, because it means we can apply it to any kind of context, independent of the kind of methodologies you might be using. It's more of a way of a framework of looking at planning for a curriculum or for lesson planning than it is an actual methodology. But we are going to be looking at some of the strategies and techniques that might be applied as we go through the webinar. Now, if your school has a strong whole school approach to EAL already, you're probably already doing lots of CLIL without necessarily realizing it. But hopefully in this webinar, we'll clarify what the key aspects are of content and language integrated provision, so that you can apply it more intentionally, or you can look at which areas you might want to develop further. Excuse me. The other point, I think, if you read about CLIL, is you'll hear people talk about CLIL as being soft CLIL or hard CLIL. And you'll see this picture of the rock there is representing the hard CLIL. And in a soft version of CLIL, it's only a part of a child's educational experience. So maybe it's only happening in a few lessons or subject areas or after school club or something. Whereas in a hard CLIL model, all or almost all the curriculum is going to be delivered in an additional language. So for most English medium international schools with a lot of multilingual pupils, we're looking at that kind of hard CLIL model as being the most appropriate. And why might that be useful? Well, the argument is that this dual development is beneficial both cognitively and linguistically. And in fact, the argument would be that it promotes linguistic development at the same time as the content knowledge, but it's also promoting things like cognitive flexibility, and it's enriching the content understanding and knowledge that's being produced in a way that's beyond just simply what would be happening if we were delivering the curriculum in the learner's home language. So it's kind of it's an additive approach if it's done effectively. It also addresses the challenge we often have when we're teaching another language, which is that it can be difficult to learn a different language using materials or resources that are decontextualized and are not, authentic or related to real life. If we're teaching it within the classroom as the children are learning, they automatically have a very real, meaningful context in which to learn and develop that language. So it in theory makes it more motivating, more effective as a medium for learning a new language. And the other thing that I would think, the other area I think it makes it really useful as a framework, especially in an international school context, is that I think it's quite an accessible way of thinking about language and content. For those people who are not necessarily EAL specialists. So I'm talking about subject specialists or classroom teachers. And I noticed a few of you in the chat have already mentioned that you are working as subject teacher for some things, or as many of you are EAL specialists. So this webinar is going to speak to both sides of that coin, because they're both equally important. And they're, as I've mentioned, both language and content are equally foregrounded in this CLIL approach. So in an international school content where not everyone's going to be a language development expert, it's a useful model to apply, I think. Okay, so we're going to move on now to looking at some of the key concepts in CLIL, and what that means for when we're applying that in an EAL context. So you can see there the 3 areas we're going to talk about. And I'm going to start with one of the most popular frameworks for thinking about CLIL. And to illustrate it, here's a picture of the sea. And that's to illustrate one of the key ideas, which is the 4 C's. And it's simply a memorable way to describe the core characteristics of a successful CLIL lesson. So with the 4 C's, first of all, a lesson going to include content. That's the progression in knowledge, skills, and understanding related to the specific elements of the curriculum that we are teaching. And obviously, that's going to be dictated by whatever curriculum you are following in your school, whether that's British curriculum, IB, US core standards, whatever that might be. So a CLIL lesson's never exclusively about language development in the way that an English as a foreign language lesson might be, for example, or an EAL, withdrawal session might be exclusively focused on language. The second C is communication. And this is the idea that all lessons should include using language to learn whilst learning to use language. That's the area we're going to be looking at in most detail today, and we're going to look at that in more detail in a moment. Excuse me. Okay. The third point is cognition. So a CLIL lesson should include developing thinking skills, which link concept formation, both abstract and concrete concepts, understanding and language altogether. And that's also going to mean identifying and teaching the language required to express those thoughts and ideas, to link it back to communication. And lastly, we have culture. So this is the idea that a CLIL lesson should include exposure to alternative perspectives, experiences, and shared understandings, which deepen awareness of students' own culture and those of others. And again, this is something that is often a cornerstone of international education anyway. So it's something that international schools tend to be quite aware of. And so, it's about moving beyond the food, flags, and festivals to that deeper knowledge and understanding of different cultures represented within the school, and exploring the complex ways that cultures, identities, and languages interact. And again, we'll keep returning to this idea that language and culture are kind of inseparable, and you have to address one, you have to be addressing the other. So you might want to take a moment to consider how present these features are in lessons in your context. It might well be the case that you're doing CLIL without realizing you're doing CLIL, but it's likely that some areas are more consistently embedded than others, which may help you know where you might want to make changes or improvements in your particular context. So next, we're going to look specifically at language development and how to think about that in a CLIL context. So I'm going to present this phrase. You've probably all heard this said at some point. If you're working in an international school, people like me love to say it all the time. Although personally, I don't love it as a phrase, because I think it kind of sounds a bit like we're mandating that suddenly everybody has a second job to do on top of their already very busy jobs as teachers of or school leaders or whatever they might be doing. But I think, again, for a CLIL context, a way of reframing this is to think of teachers as language mediators rather than language teachers. And what do I mean by that? Well, this idea comes from Ball and company, and they talk about the role of teachers being to build bridges between the learners and the new subject knowledge that we want them to acquire. So we can think of language mediation as this building a bridge between the learner and the subject knowledge. And to be honest, this is just branding, right? This is just the lens through which we see it rather than any practical difference. But for me, I feel like this is a slightly more accessible way of thinking about putting language development into your teaching than expecting, all subject teachers or classroom teachers to suddenly be like language experts or language teachers, which I think can feel a bit overwhelming. So this building bridges will involve an element of explicit language teaching sometimes, but it's also about being familiar with the different techniques and strategies needed to scaffold linguistic understanding, and also identifying what language is useful to teach and provide support for, and when this is less helpful. So we're going to explore that in a bit more depth in a moment. So Ball, as part of these principles for integrating language into CLIL, has described 6 different things we should be thinking about. Actually 7. The first one is that building bridges aspect we've just talked about. So I'm going to talk about the other 6, and they are developing that subject language awareness. This means knowing what language is used and is important in your particular subject area, what kinds of vocabulary, grammar, and so on. Now, subject specialists will already have this knowledge, but they may not necessarily be consciously aware of it. They may need to collaborate with EAL specialists to identify which aspects of that language the learners in their class will require support with. Okay, so if you're a maths teacher, you know what language your learners, you know what a good answer looks like to a maths problem in terms of the language that's used, but you might need some help identifying which areas of that language might be challenging for EAL learners. And conversely, EAL specialists will need access to the knowledge of the subject or topic specialists to know what the key concepts, ideas, and skills are that are being taught, so that they can bring that into their EAL support. So they know what are the important things I need to be supporting these learners with. So this principle works for both EAL and subject specialists. And this links neatly to the second principle, which is that planning with language in mind, and that's ensuring that language is considered in lesson plans and schemes of work and indeed curricula. And this is something that may require, again, careful collaboration between EAL teams and curriculum teachers. And one way of doing this is to conduct a curriculum language audit. So this means identifying the crucial language knowledge and skills required in each area of the curriculum and making sure these are addressed in planning. And this is often a long-term collaborative approach between EAL teams and different departments. It's not a quick fix. I'm not saying this is something that's easy to do. It is definitely a huge challenge, but I think schools that I've seen that have cracked it tend to have some medium for EAL teams and subject teams to work together in some form. The fourth principle is teaching general academic language. So that this means focusing on language that is useful across the curriculum and not just on the jargon or subject specific vocabulary specific to each topic. So the more general academic language is actually more important for learners to acquire and master because it's higher frequency and it's more useful. To give you an example, more general vocabulary like examine or process or result, it's more useful to know words like that than potentially words like, I don't know, phrases like oxbow lake or Coptic jar or electrolysis, which are very useful within those tiny topics that are being taught, but they're the sort of vocabulary that students can, learn for a short period and then forget about. That's usually okay. Whereas with the more general academic language, we need that to stick there because they're going to be using that throughout their school career and beyond. Okay, the fifth principle is to provide initial talk time for learners. And this is referring to the need for learners to verbally process their ideas in a low stakes situation before sharing them or writing them down. It's particularly useful for multilingual learners, but it's useful for everybody. And we'll return to this idea in the section on home language use. But yeah, being able to practice in a low stakes way is really important. And lastly, and linked to the above, is that activity should be sequenced going from private to public. And what I mean by that is that, again, you need to build in those opportunities to practice and rehearse using English before being expected to speak publicly or submit a final piece of writing. And it also speaks to the close connection of the CLIL approach with these task-based or project-based learning or inquiry-based learning methodologies that are popular in many settings as well, where we tend to move from this sort of planning and discussion phase into a more practical implementation and sharing phase where we might be presenting or creating outputs like videos or presentations and so on. So these principles can provide some whole school guidelines for using a CLIL approach, but I want to focus more on the classroom and what successfully integrating language actually looks like there. So that brings us to our final framework, which is the language triptych, which sounds a bit like a weird Netflix film, but it's actually a model of linguistic progression in CLIL. And this comes from a book by Coyle, Hood and Marsh, and they designed this this triptych, this triangle, this three areas of language that we need to be able to address if learners are going to develop their language alongside the content knowledge. Okay, and this acknowledges the fact that it's a bit of a contradiction if we're doing CLIL, because we all agree that learners need to be able to communicate effectively with their peers and their teachers in order to learn. But if we're making them learn in a language that they're not fully able to use, then we're going to potentially damage that learning. So it could be counterproductive. So this is a way of trying to solve that challenge. So in order to ensure this linguistic development, they argue we need to take into account these three areas. Firstly, we have the language of learning, and this is the language needed to be able to access the content being taught. It's probably the thing we're most familiar with, like the vocabulary and the grammar and so on. The second area is the language for learning, and this is the language needed to participate in classroom activities, things like pair and group work. Okay, the language needed to do the tasks. We can think about this as the classroom talk, I suppose. And the third area is language through learning, and this refers to being able to work with and develop language as it emerges in the classroom and address those gaps and extend that language, those needs as they emerge. So we can call this working with emergent language. So if teachers are familiar with these concepts and able to apply them in their planning and their teaching, it's going to hugely enhance their ability to support our plurilingual learners. So I'm going to break them down in a little bit more detail because I think it's important for us to all understand this. So the language of learning, and again, this is the area that we're probably most familiar with if you're a EAL teacher or specialist. This is the language needed to be able to access the basic concepts and skills related to the topic being taught. And we've already touched on this with this idea of teaching students academic vocabulary. And you might be familiar with the concept of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary. Tier 1 being commonly used everyday vocabulary, which we'd expect most fluent users of English to understand, but our multilingual learners, especially our new to English learners, might need some support with. Tier 2 is that more general academic vocabulary that is used across different subjects and curriculum areas. And that's the one that we really need to embed in their brains and make sure they're familiar with in order to beef up that academic language as they progress through their career. And tier 3 is that subject specific vocabulary, which, although it might seem like the most urgent need in a lot of lessons, and it is important, it's also the kind of words and vocabulary that even first language users of English are going to need to be explicitly taught because they will not have come across them before. So this is often already baked into the textbooks or the learning and the curriculum. So it often needs less attention, I suppose, from an EAL or language development point of view than the other two types. It also involves making sure students have the grammar needed to access or to participate. And it might be things like being able to use the past tense when they're talking about things that happened in the past. Passive voice and in scientific text, for example, are quite common. And using imperative forms in, well, most classroom will involve lots of instruction giving, but even activities like PE, physical education, or music might involve a lot of these forms. So again, it's the idea of being able to link them to specific subject areas and tasks as well that's quite helpful. And the other one that often gets lost, I think, is this idea of genre features, like what do different types of text involve? So, writing an experiment looks different to being able to write a fairy story. They'll all have different characteristics in them that students need to become familiar with. Exam answers are another really important one for those students later in their school career. Writing a good exam answer is very much it's a genre that's very specific, and it may even be specific to the subject area. It may even be specific to the exam board or the exam that they're taking, because we know how specific some of these requirements can be, right? To get all the marks, they have to tick the very careful set of boxes. So they need to know what those features look like. And these aspects all need to be purposefully planned into lessons and schemes of work and curriculums. And so if you want a framework for how to do that, I recommend you look at the work of Pauline Gibbons. If you're not familiar with her, she's got a really useful planning framework for integrating language and content. Okay, so language for learning then. And this is the language development that's needed to participate in all our classroom activities, especially a lot of collaborative work. And we often describe this as functional language, which means that it's language for achieving a particular purpose. We're categorizing it by what it does, not by its structure or its grammar. So I like this because you don't need to know any of the grammar terms or anything like that to think about functional language. You just need to have an understanding of what are the types of purposes we use language for in a classroom. So here's a list of the kind of things I might be talking about. And I think this is a particularly useful and pragmatic way of looking at language. And it's a really good way of thinking about how language is used in your particular subject area. And this is going to vary between different subjects and topics. So in history, for example, there might be lots of comparing and evaluating, whereas in science, there's a lot of predicting and describing. In PE, there's maybe explaining or cooperating, the language that you need to work together. So if you're interested in this area, I recommend you take a look at our great ideas pages and also the webinar that we did earlier a couple of years ago on enhancing classroom talk. And I think Shaka can share some links for that. And the last part is language through learning. And we said that this is about working with emergent language. So this isn't about teaching a particular type of language per se. This refers to the ability to work with new language and develop learners' language while they are learning non-language related topics in the curriculum. And what this might look like is things like being able to have the strategies and techniques to extend and build on the language that learners need for the lesson. So that might be like eliciting or brainstorming ways to express an idea, or eliciting different synonyms for the same word, so you can build up their vocabulary. It works really well when you have a mix of different proficiencies and language skills in the classroom. It also means having systems and procedures for recording emergent language. So it might be having a page or a section on your whiteboard where you're recording the language. you might be using an online flashcard repository. I think Quizlet is the one that I've seen that's quite popular. It could look like students having a vocab section in their exercise books, vocabulary displays on your walls. There's lots of different ways of doing that. And the other key skill is going to be having the strategies and techniques for correcting language and giving feedback and knowing when and when not to correct, but also utilizing strategies like using peer correction as well. There's a lot more to working with emergent language than those skills, but I think there are three areas that if all teaching staff were able to implement, you'd see some really powerful gains in the language development of EAL learners. And not just EAL learners, but actually fluent users of English as well, because they're all going to help your language development more holistically. And it's the most abstract of the three areas, the learning through language, but I think it's also one of the most impactful if we can address it. And I would direct you again to a webinar that we did and a blog I think we did as well earlier this year on this very topic on emergent language, if you would like to explore that in more detail. Okay, so I know that this has all been a little bit abstract up to now, okay? And that's partly because, as I say, CLIL is not really a methodology per se. It's kind of a way of looking at things. It's a framework for thinking about planning and implementation. And it is going to look really different in every single context. But I thought it would be useful to try and apply this to a specific context and situation to give us an example of what it might look like in the actual classroom, okay? So I've picked a topic which I think could be applicable in lots of different contexts, and that is science. And the specific topic is habitats, okay? And that's because I thought it's something that could work quite well, both at a primary level, but also at a secondary level. Because I know that we have people attending who work in both areas. So I thought it would be useful to take our 4 C's and to think about how this particular area could be explored using a kind of CLIL framework. So I guess we're trying to take you through the sort of thinking process that might go into planning for this topic. So to begin with then, what are we doing with time? Yeah, I tell you what, I'm going to give you a little bit of a task, and that is for our topic of habitats. I want you to think about 3 of the C's, okay? I want you to think about culture, content, and cognition. We're going to leave communication because I'm going to address that next in a bit more detail. And for that topic, and for the kind of age group of students that you work with, think about what kind of content, what kind of cultural connections, and what kinds of thinking skills or cognitive skills you could develop using this topic. And you can type your ideas in the chat. So you might want to say, type the sort of dimension you're thinking of first, like culture, and then an idea, or content and an idea, and cognition and then an idea. It's just for fun. So I'll give you a minute or two. We'll see what ideas we get. Nice, I like it. Okay, so we've already got somebody cognition categorizing from Philip. That's yes. And Rosie's put, oh God, habitat's the same. Yes, different countries, different animals. So yeah, we're talking about the human interaction, describing, excellent, comparing habitats, cognition and culture. I love how people are already blending these, right? You'll realize already, right, that these aren't really distinct. They all kind of blend together. Comparing different habitats, excellent. Cognitive sorting. Yes, okay. Okay, oh, that's amazing ideas coming through. Clearly, there'll be some of you who probably are science teachers in your own right, and you probably have got a much more in-depth understanding of this issue than I do as a language specialist. Ooh, I love it. Someone's applied it to their local context. Singapore. Nice. Not a science teacher. Well, no, but that sound like really valid options. Um, oh, fears and superstitions about animals. Oh, I love that. That's a really good link to culture, isn't it? Okay, oh, there's some brilliant ideas coming through. So like I say, this is really just an exercise in the kind of thinking we might want to do when we're planning for a sort of CLIL approach. So please, by all means, continue adding your ideas, and also if you're responding in the chat, remember to click the "To Everyone" button at there's a little blue button above the chat box, so that you're sending your message so everyone can see it, not just so hosts and panelists can see it. Because I can see loads of good ideas coming through, but only to hosts and panelists. It's one of the weird quirks of Moodle. All right, so I'm going to put some suggestions. These are not, there's no right or wrong answer here per se, and we'll have a look at them together. So if we were looking at culture, then people have already offered these suggestions, but we could link it to our local issues. We could look at different groups' perspectives, and there's loads of other great examples that have been put in the chat. For content, again, I mean, the list could go on, and it will depend on the age of the students and so on. But yeah, we've already got with types of habitat, types of species and their habitats, how living things interact, human influences, and protecting habitats and things like that would be really fruitful areas. And cognition, and again, I think a lot of these have already been mentioned. But certainly there'll be a lot of describing, won't there? Being able to describe habitats or describe the creatures that live in those habitats. Understanding cause and effect, being able to visualize that. So yeah, someone just mentioned food chains, for example, and that's something that obviously lends itself very well to a graphic organizer of some kind. Predicting and hypothesizing effects, and investigating solutions. These are all things that are going to require quite complex thinking skills. Okay. Let's shift to language. I'm not going to ask you to contribute to this one because we haven't got time, but if we think about communication through the lens of the language triptych, language of learning, for learning, and through learning, then we might come up with things like of learning. We've got that tier 3 vocabulary, which might be the types of habitat, rainforest, savanna, swamp, whatever that might be, and the different species of animals or other wildlife. Adjectives describing words are going to be really important, excuse me. In terms of grammar, things like being able to talk about the future and use conditional verb forms for speculating about or hypothesizing about cause and effect. So, if we use fertilizers on these fields over here, then this might cause negative impact on this habitat over here. And yeah, overall language for describing things, again, it's a very rich area for exploring language, but it could be as simple as making sure students know the difference between there is and there are for describing singular and plural. And of course, it could get a lot more complex depending on the needs of the learners. In terms of for learning, again, people have already mentioned a lot of these, so I won't go through them all, but we have options like that. And language through learning, again, this is actually the one that obviously this is by its nature, this isn't planned. This is something that just happens and will emerge in the lesson. But it might look like I'm developing learners' skills with using dictionaries, because maybe they have to look up in the dictionary different types of habitats or species or words for describing those. So yeah, developing those independent skills for them to be able to use dictionaries, and these days increasingly it might be online as well as physical. with our primary or early years, picture dictionaries are amazing for this. The more you can get kids independently using picture dictionaries, so they just run off and go, I can just, I don't need to have the teacher tell me. I can just go and look at this picture dictionary and I can find loads of cool examples of the thing I'm interested in. It might be something like creating mind maps, like a brainstorm diagram for each habitat type with language connected to that. It could also be, developing presenting skills, and how this is learning language through learning is that if, for example, you were having your students present, I don't know, a poster or a project that they've been working on, it's having some kind of peer assessment element to that. So, having the children thinking about the language needed to present successfully, and assessing their peers on how well they're using that language. And then that could be linked to providing feedback that then they can apply in the future and you can address more explicitly. So these are all opportunities for building language. And lastly, talking about habitats, I just wanted to share with you some prompts, and these come from the CLIL book that I've already referenced. These are some prompts that might help you to decide which areas of language it is useful to focus on, because it is a bit overwhelming sometimes to decide what and what not to think about. I'll give you a moment to read those. And you can never cover every aspect of language that all the learners in your class will need. So this is where a language-focused curriculum audit is useful to ensure that all language areas are covered at different times, and that there is an element of progression and repetition of key language as well, across subject areas, and within subject areas as well. It's yeah, it's not necessarily there isn't really an easy answer to any of these questions either, which is why I'm not sitting here saying, well, it's this and this and this, because it is going to depend entirely on your context, your learners, and your situation as to what the correct answers to these questions are. Okay, so just to finish off, I think it's really useful to look at how a CLIL approach might be adapted in a more modern multilingual context of bringing in all students' languages into the classroom and not just relying on English. So CLIL very much evolved in a time where the best practice was felt to be immersion and English only in the classroom, and we don't really need to worry about children's other languages. Whereas, of course, now we know that that's perhaps not the best approach for helping learners develop their language skills, whether it's English or whether that's their other languages. So I thought it would be useful to look at the 4Cs framework that we've already explored and apply that to how we might bring in home languages and integrate those in a CLIL setting. So let's start with content. And when it comes to the content dimension, I think this is where translation or using translation tools is going to play the biggest role. And I think this is the strategy that I see most commonly used in a lot of international schools. Understandably so, right? It sort of seems like the most obvious thing to do to support our multilingual students. But I think with translation and translated materials, it's all about, again, having that planned approach and making sure it's not just, oh, let's just translate everything, but it's choosing when and where to translate. And we can look at things like using or creating multilingual glossaries. So you can provide those. You can, AI is developing apace, and I think one of the things it is actually quite good at is producing multilingual glossaries with simplified definitions. It can be used to provide simplified definitions in English of English language terminologies. It can be used to describe to give translations in languages. If you work with a multilingual group, perhaps, and you aren't able to, you know, do that yourself, it's a useful approach for where you could explore AI. Um, Providing translated text, again, it's going to very much depend on how much access you have to that, and also how able you are to assess the quality of those translations. I guess AI could be used here as well, although I haven't explored. I don't know well enough the different AI tools that are out there to know how well they will translate, say, textbook text and things like that into different languages. I would always recommend you making sure, if you can, that you do vet these things with a proficient user of the language if you can, before giving them to your learners. Um, Reverse translations are a really useful tool for, I think, particularly learners at secondary level, where they're more cognitively developed, and also for learners who perhaps have already got a really strong home language grasp of academic language. Perhaps they've studied at a school in their home language and moved to an English medium school midway through their education. And reverse translation works by, you give them an English text, let's say it's a reading from a textbook or something like that. You ask the learner to translate it into their home language, which is always the easier way of translating something into your strongest language. Then you take away the original English text, and they translate it into English back. They translate the home language text they've written back into English, but without being able to see the original. And they try and see how close to the original they can get. It's a really good way of getting them to raise awareness of those of the commonalities between the home language and English, and where it's different, and how different ideas and phrases translate, especially when it comes to developing those academic language skills. And I think Philip's just mentioned a really good point, which is, always leave a gap between the L1 back to English. So it's a good point about how giving a bit of a space, so that they don't just, the ones with a good memory aren't just able to verbatim repeat the English text that they remembered. But it's a really powerful tool to use, I think. And in translation, a lot of translation activities have fallen out of fashion in the language classroom, but I think they're potentially really, really useful in a lot of ways. And the final point I make there is, allowing students to make notes or annotate things in their own language. There's not, I think that's often a really good way of strengthening their understanding of what's happening. Allowing them to do that and just making it clear that it's acceptable and it's fine for them to do that if that helps them. If that's going to help them remember, then allow them to do so. So, as I've mentioned, the really key question here is when to use translations and when is it better to use English. And it obviously will depend on lots of factors, like the learners, the resources you've got available, and your learning objectives, and so on. But I think what a useful question to ask yourself is, what can I do to reduce cognitive load? Okay, because what we know about learning is that if students are overloaded cognitively, then there is no learning happening. So we need to make sure that there's that balance of challenge. So, ask yourself, does everything need to be in English? Where you have very cognitively demanding tasks, then using translated information might be more appropriate, because you're taking away some of that cognitive load, compared to a task where the learners should already be familiar with or have already learned that content in English, and then therefore maybe it shouldn't be as cognitively demanding for them. So communication then, in terms of communication, bringing in home language might look like, having that pre-task discussion that we spoke about earlier, but doing it in the home language, where you have students who share a home language. Sometimes it's a case of letting them get all their ideas off their chest in their home language, and then returning to those ideas to express them in English. But if we allow them to express those ideas first in their stronger language, you're going to get much deeper, much richer, more cognitively demanding ideas. Language buddies, of course, is a really common strategy where we can pair learners who share a language, especially where one child might be new to English and then others might have more developed English. That can work quite well. And another really key one is encouraging home language at home, and making sure that both parents and carers know that developing home language skills alongside English will strengthen and not weaken their English. So it's particularly important where parents or carers don't necessarily use English very fluently themselves. It's absolutely okay for them to talk to their child's homework, um, even if it's all English based. They can still talk about that topic area in their home language, if that's the language they're more comfortable in. And that's going to benefit the learner as well, because they're going to then be exposed to language in their home language on topics that they've learned in school. It's going to strengthen both a home language and English development as well. And like I think normalizing home language use is really important. Just making sure learners know it's okay to switch between languages, and also know which context where it's okay and when it's useful, when it's less useful. For example, when you lack the word in English, just say it in your first home language. Just keep the flow of communication. Make sure they know, uh, you know, why they're using the language, why they're using English, for example, for a particular task. So if they're practicing for an exam, if they're going to be assessed in English, then obviously it makes sense that they're doing all their practice and their language development more in English. But if they're just brainstorming ideas for something, it could be done in a home language. For cognition, I think there's two things there's two sides of this coin. We can think about it from the learner's perspective, so getting them to explore ideas, activate prior knowledge, research new topics in a home language. Or we can think about it from the teacher's point of view. So the teacher could also use home language if you share it with your students and you have a class who share their home language to do things like scaffolding instructions, clarifying key ideas and concepts. And the third one, translating success criteria and task rubrics. And this one, you don't need to share your students' language, because you can often use online translation tools for doing this. But actually, that can be quite powerful. The more deeply students understand the task and what they're expected to do to succeed in it, the more likely they are to produce good quality work. And again, that can be often, if there's a language barrier on that understanding of the task, then you're just not going to get the outcome that you necessarily want. So I think that's really important. And looking at culture, then we've already mentioned that culture and language are intimately connected, so they are inseparable. And if you want to create a multicultural classroom, then language is going to play a really important role. So again, this might look like exploring linguistic identities. That means getting learners to share their linguistic profiles with each other. I've seen schools do this with drawings, sculptures, even posters, lots of different ways of expressing their identities and how that relates to the languages that they have in their lives. Um, Sharing songs and poems in home languages, make it normal to bring in and share linguistic jewels from the languages that are represented in your group. Comparing languages build that culture of curiosity around language. How do you say that in your language? I make that kind of just a normal question in your classroom. This is really powerful. You'd be amazed how quickly kids will just start doing this naturally once the idea is introduced, because it's just fascinating. Humans love talking about languages and comparing them. And at secondary level with older kids, it could be things like comparing like idiomatic language and phrases. In early years, it could be as simple as comparing animal noises. What animal does a pig make in your language and a dog make? In a multilingual classroom, it's such a fun thing to do. And you can then decide which language has got the best animal noise, because it's a wonderful one to do. I love that. Um, you can tell I'm a language nerd. I get all excited about comparing languages, but I genuinely think it is fascinating for the majority of learners. Um, and then seeking out relevant home language texts as well. And this this is idea that, can you replace a text that is in your that you're using in your curriculum that may have no relevance to your learners with one that does, whether that's a novel or a poem or a song. Look for opportunities to integrate that culture, and that could, there could be home language texts which we could then translate into English if we need to be able to work with them into in English for whatever purpose. All right, and to end, or almost at the end, but I want to touch on two final considerations. And we can think of these as perhaps the fifth and the sixth C of CLIL, because they both start with C, I realized as I was planning this webinar. So the fifth C would be the collaboration, right? And this is run through, I think, as a theme, isn't it, of this webinar, but a CLIL approach demands that subject specialists and classroom teachers work closely together with EAL specialists when they're planning. And this could be quite formal. Could be arranging planning meetings between EAL staff and heads of department, building in collaborative planning time between subject teachers and EAL teachers. Some schools even use co-teaching models. But I also understand that, in a lot of contexts that may not be realistic or feasible. And it can also be less formal. And that looks like, ensuring that EAL teachers and classroom teachers share the same spaces for planning, so that there can be that, organic swapping of ideas and expertise, or just that the EAL department has an open door policy, and making sure that EAL staff are valued and used, because they often get underutilized in school. So, if you're an EAL teacher and you're standing at the back of a classroom half the time, like, well, why am I here? Then, advocate for yourself. Like, there's probably better ways that your expertise can be used in this CLIL model, with things like helping inform planning and doing that kind of language audit exercise we talked about. And the last C, then the sixth C, if you like, of CLIL that I've just invented is CPD, continuing professional development. And the kind of CLIL skills that you would like staff to have, I think, can be summarized in these three areas. So all teachers need to understand the linguistic demands of their subject. We've talked already about what that might look like. They need an understanding of meta-linguistic terminology. And again, if you're like me and you were born in an English-speaking country, but you didn't learn grammar at school, you may not be aware of a lot of basic grammar terminology and knowledge. Certainly in the UK, they didn't teach us grammar when we were growing up. But this is also where your teachers who learnt English as an additional language probably have an advantage, because they probably already know a lot of this stuff because they learnt it themselves, and are therefore hopefully better at explaining that and understanding how their learners might be struggling with that. And language pedagogies, which again, this is the sort of we have so many resources on this as the foundation, but yeah, being able to introduce new vocabulary, check understanding, and work with emergent language would be a really important skills. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't link these to our some of our online courses. So I just wanted to make you aware, if you are interested in developing these areas in staff, we have a couple of our understanding language for learning and embedding language for learning courses look at these first two areas, explore those in a lot of detail. There's some strategies in there as well, but they're quite practical. And if you're interested particularly in these pedagogies, then we have an adaptive teaching course, which is all about the kind of pedagogies that teachers might use. And again, these are aimed more at classroom teachers or subject specialists than EAL specialists, but they could also be useful if you're an EAL teacher, and especially if you're new to the role. Okay, and I'm almost finished, but I'll leave you with a final quote from CLIL. And I think this is the key point of CLIL, which is it's all about planning, and it's that planned and purposeful combination of language, content, and culture that makes it important. And I think it's this framework of planning everything with language and content in mind, and the mindset that views both of being of the same level of importance, that's really valuable and really useful in an international school EAL context. If you want to read more, they're the two books that I've been using most as references in this presentation. We will also share this with you later, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'll pass you over to Shaka for the final
Yes,
Goodbye.
thank you so much, Tom, for this presentation. You finished right on time. So I'd say if anyone has any questions for Tom following the webinar, feel free to let us know, drop us an email, a message, and we'll get back to you. And so just before we finish, I wanted to make you aware of some upcoming events. We'll be running 2 more free webinars before the end of this year, so keep an eye out. And or if you don't want to be checking our social media or our website regularly, you can also join our newsletter and you will always be amongst the first to know when we have a new event up. And I also just wanted to remind everyone that bookings are open for our online courses. Tom has just mentioned 2 or 3 of them for the whole school year. So if you're planning any CPD for yourself or you would like to recommend some to your colleagues or school staff, we have got courses aimed at different roles. Also, just to make you aware, we've got early discounts available for early bookings. So yeah, the earlier you book, the bigger the discount available. So have a look on our website. I think I've shared the link before, but we will also share it with the recording of the webinar. And finally, just a reminder that you will receive the recording within 48 hours and will also include any links to the webinars and resources and anything else that Tom mentioned during his talk. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.